Welcome back to Wrong Sports, and this is not my first What If video, and I seem to have gotten stuck into doing them. I wasn't going to do one about the decade of the 2000s, but I just found so many interesting college football coaching hires that I just had to do another list. So if you haven't checked out my previous ones, you can check them all out in the archives. Also, in the link below, I got a playlist as well, so you can check them all out. I also have a basketball what if as well. And this will probably be my last what if for a while. And in this list, I have about 7 what ifs with a lot of moving parts and 3 smaller what ifs. And if you're wondering what a smaller what if coaching decision / hire is, well, let's start out with my first one. What if Navy doesn't hire Paul Johnson? Navy was looking for someone to turn around a winless team, and it was down to Paul Johnson, who had won a lot at Georgia Southern, and Tim Murphy, who was at Harvard at this point, and he would actually just recently retire from the job. And Navy would spur Murphy, leaving him at Harvard for the next 2 decades, and go with Johnson, who was the more running-oriented offense, but Murphy might have been an interesting pick as Murphy knew the Northeast. He was winning at Harvard at this point, which is obviously an Ivy League school. It had a lot of academic standards, high academic standards, like Navy does. So it's not like he would be jumping into anything he didn't know. But the Navy hire of Paul Johnson really worked out. It set them up quite nicely for the next 2 decades. And Navy, they did have a little down spurt recently, but they're still doing fantastic. And I expect a really good season out of them in 2025. But staying in the Northeast, another smaller what if, I got to go to the Big East and my favorite team. That would be, what if Rutgers didn't hire Greg Schiano in 2001? Now, I have been a Rutgers fan for nearly 3 decades, and I will say coaching at Rutgers and winning there is not easy. It might be one of the hardest jobs, but somehow Rutgers has managed to talk Schiano into leaving Miami in the early 2000s to come back up to Piscataway, New Jersey to coach lowly Rutgers, who had some of their worst seasons leading up to the new millennium. Schiano was their first choice, and they did have another choice who I will get to very soon, but Schiano was really a top choice because he was a New Jersey native. He was also a graduate assistant for a year at Rutgers in the late 1980s, and their second choice was a coach that not a lot of people knew about in the Northeast, but he was gaining a lot of traction in 2001. That would be Gary Darnell. Darnell was at Western Michigan. He had started there in 1997. He had winning seasons, including a 9-win season in 2000, where they were one of the best offenses in the MAC and also in all of college football. Rutgers had actually interviewed with Darnell, but he would eventually re-sign with Western Michigan, and he would not have the same success he did with the Broncos, as he would have 4 losing seasons from 2001 to 2005 and never coached again. Schiano, meanwhile, has been coaching Rutgers for most of the last 20 years. He had a little break there when he went to the NFL, which I'm still not over about. But anyway, he brought them to their highest of heights that they have ever been, and I hope he never leaves the job, because when he did leave, it was very sad. But anyway, one more small what if has to do with Clemson, as in the middle of 2008, Tommy Bowden left, and Dabo Swinney, the rather unknown wide receiver coach, took over the coaching gig. But according to message board rumors, and also some people have talked about this on radio and have asked questions about it, but according to those rumors, Will Muschamp was also Clemson's first choice, but he couldn't get out of his Texas deal, as Muschamp had just been named the coach in waiting behind Mac Brown in Texas, and apparently it was difficult for Clemson to sign a coach under a contract like that and get him out of that contract. Muschamp ended up not even coaching at Texas and would have 2 tenures at other SEC schools that didn't go well. So fortunately for Dabo and for Clemson, the school would stand with Dabo, and he rewarded them with 2 national titles, always being in the national title discussion and really becoming one of the top powers in college football. So those are the 3 smaller what-if coaching decisions / hires, and I will have more coaching hires in the decade of the 2000s. But before I get into that, make sure as always you are subscribed to the channel below, ring the bell so you can get updates on brand new videos I will be dropping in the future. Also, please check out my Patreon, patreon.com/wrongsports, doing exclusive blogs and videos there. Also doing my game picks as well, so you can check that out in the link below. And please like and share this video, share this channel with other college sports fans. starting it off with one of the more interesting coaching stories. And this is kind of a big what if, just because I need to cover not even just a coaching decision, but like the entire spring and summer of 2003 went differently for Alabama. I understand that sounds dumb, but this is a multiple what if, because I could even ask the question of what if Texas A&M didn't fire R.C. Slocum this year too, because they did in fact fire him, even though he never had a losing season and did take Texas A&M through some NCAA violations during his tenure. But had that firing not happened, or resignation or whatever you want to call it, Dennis Franchione would have stayed at Alabama and thus not have started Alabama's crazy 2003 spring and summer. There were a lot of candidates that Alabama AD Mal Moore looked at for the job. He actually interviewed and offered the job to Mike Riley, who was a New Orleans assistant. But Riley, who is an Alabama alum, some people forget about that, he actually declined the job after Alabama pressured Riley too much, and Riley actually wanted to interview with UCLA, and Alabama wanted his decision before he went for that interview, so because of that, he declined the job, apparently. So that could also be a what if, since Riley didn't end up at UCLA either. But Alabama missed out on Riley, so they actually went out and interviewed Jim Leavitt next, who had built the South Florida program from scratch. He didn't work out, so they would go to Les Miles from Oklahoma State. Now, the Les Miles interviews actually went quite further than the Leavitt interviews went, which would have been an interesting alternate reality, but they would also go out and interview another coach in Mike Price, who apparently would jump over Jim Leavitt and Les Miles and take the job. And I talked about this hire in my worst coaching hires in the decades of the 2000s, so I won't go over much more about this, but he would be gone after a few months. Lucky for Alabama, they didn't lose much with Price, since he didn't actually sign a contract thus yet. But since it was May, they didn't have too much time or too many coaches to choose from now. So they went after Alabama alums who were NFL assistants in Sylvester Croom, Richard Williamson, and eventual hire Mike Shula. Williamson had the most experience, as he had a few years as Memphis head coach and also NFL head coach experience. Sylvester Croom could have been also interesting, because he didn't have head coaching experience, but he had experience working under Coach Bryant for a decade and would have been the first black SEC head coach. Instead of hiring them, though, they went out and hired Mike Shula, who didn't have head coaching experience or experience working under or playing under Bear Bryant. But he had the Shula name and was looking to get out of being the Miami Dolphins quarterback coach. So when Alabama called, he answered, and he had a lot of work to do. But also, many people will say if the Mike Shula hiring didn't happen, then the Nick Saban hire wouldn't have happened a few years later. So again, there's so many what ifs, but I wanted to start off with this what if because it had so many layers to it. And also, I'm going to be mentioning Mike Riley again because he comes up in this next what if. That would be, what if Pete Carroll wasn't hired at USC in 2001? Now, if you forget, Pete Carroll was a flameout in the NFL, as he did have a winning record, but it was 33-31, and he wouldn't make his mark on the league like he would a decade or so later with the Seahawks. Carroll, though, was out of a job after the 1999 season, and he sat out of football until USC called him. But Carroll wasn't the first call that USC made, as Carroll was actually their fourth choice to take over the USC football job. They first went after then Oregon State coach Dennis Erickson, who instead signed a contract extension with the Oregon State Beavers. Then they stayed in Oregon, and they went after Oregon head coach Mike Bellotti, who would end up doing the same and sign an extension. The search would then move to the San Diego Chargers and their head coach, Mike Riley, who I mentioned in the previous What If. He had been an assistant coach at USC before later becoming the head coach of Oregon State, before then moving to the NFL and eventually moving back to Oregon State. But that would be before this. Right now, he is at the San Diego Chargers, and he was actually stuck at San Diego, he could not leave due to contractual obligations he had. There was a clause in his contract. There was a whole bunch of stuff going on, so he couldn't get out. Also, he was hesitant about moving his family to Los Angeles. Due to all of this, it opened the door for the fourth choice Pete Carroll. So a lot of things had to fall through the cracks for USC for Pete Carroll to be hired, and it's one of the best college football coaching hires to happen in like the last 30 years, right up there with Nick Saban at Alabama, pretty much. I do think that Mike Riley would have done very well at USC, since he knew the school, he knew the area, plus he had great success at Oregon State just before this, and would go back a few years later and upset USC a couple of times. Also, Dennis Erickson would have been the most interesting hire to USC for me. Erickson knew offense, and he knew how to recruit for big-time teams as he had success at Miami, so I think he could have had big-time success at USC, but I don't think he would have stayed very long. Anyway, here's another multi-layer what-if scenario. This is a three-part what-if, and it has to do with Georgia football at the turn of the century. My first what-if is what if Georgia didn't fire Jim Donnan? He was coming off of a 6-year tenure at Marshall, where he won a Division I AA national title. He got the team ready for their move to the Division I single A level, and then in 1996, he was hired by Georgia with the backing of their legendary head coach and athletic director Vince Dooley. Coach Donnan would have a really good record of 40-19 across 5 seasons and 4 straight bowl game wins. But according to the Georgia president at this time, the coach lost confidence of many in the administration and also many donors. Plus, Georgia lost 3 straight games to Georgia Tech, which is always frowned upon. With 2 years left on his contract, Georgia would basically fire him. Well, really, they just bought out his contract. So, yeah, I guess they fired him. He got paid, though. And the school would go out and look for a new coach. That would be up to the president of the university's standards. But what if Georgia stayed with Donnan for another 2 years? He had the backing of Dooley, and the coach was surprised that he was fired. But if you look at the last 3 seasons he was at Georgia, it was clear that something was up because they would start strong and then falter in the mid to late October period, ruining their shot at the SEC title. That would lead me into my next phase of this what if being, what if Mark Richt took the UVA job in 2000, thus not getting hired by Georgia. After George Welsh retired at UVA in 2000, UVA were looking all over for their next coach, and they weren't looking for just former coaches, as they would go after young coordinators, with Mark Richt at the top of their list. He was a hot name for coaching jobs throughout the 1990s, as I mentioned him a few times in my previous video, and you can see a link above also in the description below. But Richt was considered for the job and visited, but it never got to a point where he would sign, as he had his eyes on Georgia and eventually would sign with the Bulldogs. But had Virginia managed to hire Mark Richt, it would have turned UVA into a bigger ACC power, and it could have happened rather quickly, like Mark Richt did with Georgia, as he would get them to double-digit wins within about 2 or 3 years. And that wasn't crazy to assume, since Mark Richt knew the conference well, since he was an offensive coordinator at Florida State for the better part of the last decade. But he wasn't the only person that University of Virginia looked at for this job, as UVA also had a chance to hire Jerry Sandusky. And I know, I'm sorry, I got to mention this, but this is to do with this multi-layer scenario here. Sorry, but thankfully to UVA, they didn't hire him, but there were discussions happening at this point. Sandusky had retired from Penn State at this point, but since he was a defensive coordinator with 2 national title teams, UVA talked with him about the job. It was later reported that Virginia didn't go far with their discussions with Sandusky, but here's why I wanted to bring it up, because I think if Virginia would have gone further with interviews with Sandusky, they may have done a background check. That means they may have discovered some of the horrible and heinous things that he did, especially in the late 90s, and the reason why he may have resigned from his job. I don't want to get involved in that because I don't want this video to get demonetized, but anyway, that's why I wanted to mention it. I just wanted to say, if UVA had done this background check, they could have found something, and again, I'm glad that the hiring didn't happen because Sandusky's obviously a terrible person, but Sandusky wasn't hired, and UVA would actually go out and hire Al Groh from the NFL. He left the Jets for this job, which I don't blame him as a Giants fan. But anyway, I don't want to get involved in that either. Again, just a crazy scenario here, just like the one about Alabama that started with R.C. Slocum and then goes all the way down to Mike Shula. This one starts all the way up at Jim Donnan and then ends with Virginia not hiring Jerry Sandusky. So there are some multi-layer what-if scenarios that I had to go over in the 2000s. These next few are going to be quicker what-if scenarios because they don't really involve multi-layers. My first one has to do with what if Urban Meyer chose to go to Notre Dame. After leading Utah to a top 10 finish in 2004, Urban Meyer was a top name in college football. He was actually a top name before that when he led Bowling Green to really good records too. But Meyer was an Ohio guy as he went to Cincinnati, but he always envisioned himself as the head coach of the Irish. Meyer was a Notre Dame wide receiver coach under Bob Davie from 1996 to 2000, so he had seen what it took to be a Notre Dame coach. And as the 2004 season wound down, he took an interview or two with Notre Dame, as well as interviews with the University of Florida. But he would say, I was offered the Notre Dame job and the Florida job. I'm Irish Catholic and I love Notre Dame. I would go there in a minute. But the reason I took the Florida job, not many people know this, is because I had young kids at the time. When you recruit for Notre Dame, you recruit Los Angeles, Phoenix, New Jersey, New York, Florida. Basically saying he didn't want to travel a lot for recruiting. But you do have to travel a lot to recruit for Florida as well. But again, that was the reason he gave out for not taking the Notre Dame job. The job was open for a while, and Notre Dame would settle on Charlie Weis, which was a disastrous decision that cost millions in buyouts and was underwhelming on the field. But what if Meyer had taken that job? Notre Dame might have returned to national relevance sooner, potentially winning a national title under Meyer. I mean, Charlie Weis won double-digit games with the talent he had at Notre Dame in his first two seasons. He eventually crashed out, but he did have some good seasons there at the beginning. Also, if Meyer took the job and won, it would have helped Notre Dame fans and other college football fans overlook the George O'Leary mishap that happened only 3 years before this. And that whole thing I went over in a previous list as well. In addition, if Meyer had gone to Notre Dame, it would have changed the fortunes of several Midwest schools because Meyer would have been able to recruit Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania a lot, and this could have affected Big Ten schools. Finally, if Meyer had went to Notre Dame and had the same career as Charlie Weis, that means 2 good seasons at the beginning and then just doing pretty mediocre and terrible after that, would Meyer have gotten another shot at Ohio State? I know Charlie Weis was given another shot at Kansas, which also went terribly, but that was Kansas after all. And really, here's my biggest question for this whole what if. That would be, if Urban Meyer took the Notre Dame job, how long do you think he would have stayed at Notre Dame? Tell me in the comments below, because I think he would have stayed maybe 6 years at the job. He would have gotten probably the same amount of time that Charlie Weis did. So maybe he could have won. I mean, he did win rather quickly at Ohio State. So there's just an example right there. And speaking of Urban Meyer, he is a part of this next coaching search, coaching what-if scenario, just a whole big thing that started because of one guy. That would be Nebraska athletic director Steve Peterson. He came to the campus in 2002 after a tenure at Pitt that also ended controversially, and he would sit through a 7-7 season and then a 9-3 season by their football team and their football coach Frank Solich, and said, you know what, let's get rid of Solich and let's go after a new candidate, a high-profile candidate, because that's what Peterson told boosters and other administrators, that high-profile candidates were interested in coming to Lincoln, Nebraska to coach the Nebraska Cornhuskers. One of the most high-profile candidates he mentioned was Steve Spurrier, who at this point was in the NFL, and Peterson talked a big game as if all he needed to do was offer the job to Spurrier, and Spurrier would be coming to Lincoln, except it was the complete opposite, because Spurrier wasn't interested at all all in leaving the NFL and or coming to Nebraska. So after that went away, he would go to Utah and go after the guy I previously mentioned. That would be Urban Meyer. But the interview process of Urban Meyer to Nebraska did not go nearly as far as Notre Dame trying to get Urban Meyer, so Urban Meyer was out of the picture now. So now we've got a very disjointed, unorganized coaching search here by an athletic director who just made this decision willy-nilly pretty much, because if you look back at Frank Solich, he had 58 wins during his first 6 seasons at Nebraska. That would be more wins than Bob Devaney and Tom Osborne, who are legendary coaches that preceded Solich. The coaching search, though, would hit rock bottom when apparently a Nebraska donor had sent their plane, their jet, to Fayetteville, Arkansas, so that Nebraska could try and woo away Houston Nutt from Arkansas. Instead, though, Houston Nutt left the plane to sit on the tarmac for several hours, pretty much half the day, while Houston Nutt was renegotiating his contract with Arkansas, so they would be out of the Houston Nutt sweepstakes now. With really nowhere else to go, Bo Pelini was picked as the guy who would coach the team in the 2002 Alamo Bowl and would actually lead them to a win. And he would interview for the job as well, but he wouldn't get it. Also, Nebraska legend Turner Gill would also interview for the Nebraska job, but not get it either. Instead, Peterson went in a completely different direction, as he went for a brand new candidate, a guy who hadn't even coached in college in over a decade, and ran a completely different offense than Nebraska ran for the last 40 years. That would be Bill Callahan. He was picked because it looked like he was going to be the guy to bring Nebraska into the new century, where he would install this great West Coast offense and he would lead Nebraska to more wins. Instead, though, Bill Callahan led them to a losing record in his first season, which was Nebraska's first losing season in like over 40 years, and he would only lead them to an 8-win season and a 9-win season and a total record of 27-22. Peterson would actually end up leaving Nebraska towards the end of November in 2007 as he would head back to Pitt, and that would bring in Tom Osborne to be the new athletic director in 2007, and he would go out and hire Bo Pelini, who would average about 9 wins for the Cornhuskers before he eventually left or was fired or whatever happened there. And you just got to wonder, had Nebraska not fired Solich, or maybe had hired Bo Pelini as the replacement, what would have happened there? It would have been interesting because Bo Pelini obviously talks a lot about his time with Nebraska and how he didn't really like it towards the end and wanted to get out of there. So I don't know how long he would have lasted either. So it's just a really interesting what if scenario. What if coaching hire and firing that happened here at Nebraska? Up next is a what if scenario that doesn't get talked about a lot, but I have a lot of reasons for why I want to talk about it. That would be, what if Paul Pasqualoni wasn't fired from Syracuse in 2005? And this connects a bit with another what if I mentioned earlier, that being Pete Carroll in USC. And that was because Pete Carroll was hired by Darryl Gross when Gross was in the athletic department at USC. But Gross would leave USC a few years after the hiring of Carroll and would end up at Syracuse. And one of the first things he did was fire the longtime football coach. And this was even after the president of Syracuse said that he would be coming back the next year. The only reason given was that the team had gone through a decline over the last few years, but Pasqualoni only had 1 losing season in his 14 years with the Orange. Plus, in his last season of 2004, Syracuse co-won the Big East. It was a 4-way tie, but still, he won the conference. Pasqualoni would get another shot at coaching in the Big East again as he took over UConn in 2011, but it resulted in a 10-18 record over 2.5 seasons, and it resulted in him getting canned again. But what if Syracuse didn't fire him and hire Greg Robinson? I have mentioned Robinson before in another list of my worst college football coaching hires because he was quite terrible, as he would coach Syracuse for 4 years with 0 winning seasons, finishing last or dead last in the Big East all 4 years, which is pretty crazy to do when you have Temple and Rutgers there and UConn as well. It's tough to finish last all 4 years. It really is. And the firing of Pasqualoni was not only a detriment to Syracuse, not only for that year, but also for years to come, as he was still a big recruiter and actually one of the best recruiters in the Northeast, always getting whoever he went after, especially if they were in New York. One story in particular is that Ray Rice was all set and ready to go to Syracuse, But then when the coach was fired, he switched his commitment to Rutgers, and that would set up Rutgers for the next few years and also put them on par with other Northeast schools like Syracuse, while Syracuse got pushed further down, and it would take them a few years and several coaches to fix it, plus they would end up moving to the ACC, so that also helped them too. I really wanted to mention this because I wanted to mention the whole Ray Rice recruitment because it helps out my favorite team, Rutgers. And finally, I'm in the SEC with Alabama. And what if Alabama hired Rich Rodriguez in 2006? Alabama's athletic director, Mal Moore, was looking to hire a coach that could get Alabama back on track after a topsy-turvy decade or so. Moore and Alabama initially targeted Rich Rodriguez, then the head coach at West Virginia, and a top name for many power teams looking for a new coach. Rodriguez was reportedly offered the job before West Virginia's regular season finale, but ultimately he turned it down to remain at West Virginia. There were a few reasons for this. First off, Rich Rod was a West Virginia alum, and he coached in West Virginia most of his career. He's actually back there as of the 2025 season, which is great. In addition, Rodriguez had built West Virginia into a high-scoring team that were named to many writers and analysts' list for national title contender in 2006 and 2007. But had Rich Rod taken the Alabama job, would he have won at Alabama so quickly? I mean, he may have gotten some of those guys to transfer over with him, but it wasn't as easy as it is now. Or would it have gone like his tenure at Michigan? Most people think it may have gone the Michigan way, since Rich Rod at Michigan started with 3 wins, then went to 5, and finally 7 before he was shown the door. So he did make some gradual improvement, but it wasn't enough for a powerful school. And I tell you what, if he was winning 3 games at Alabama, I don't know what would have happened to it, but it might not have been something good. But after Rich Rodriguez didn't go for the Alabama job, it was kind of shocking, but not really when Alabama initially went after Nick Saban. The rumors went out, and this was before the NFL season was over. So remember, there was the whole thing about Nick Saban saying, I'm not leaving the NFL, and then he ended up leaving to Alabama. We all knew it was going to happen. And it's just really funny because it was always talked about how Nick Saban left the Dolphins and he's a terrible person, but now it's mentioned about how it was the greatest move ever because he won so many national titles with Alabama, and he's considered one of the greatest college football coaches of all time because of him leaving the Dolphins for this job. But anyway, one more thing I'll mention about this what if. It's kind of funny too because both Rich Rodriguez and Nick Saban are both from West Virginia and were also born in the same county and only grew up a few miles from each other. So it's just funny that they're connected to this Alabama job, and they were so connected pretty much most of their lives too, just from where they were born. Anyway, tell me what you think about all of these what if scenarios. Tell me if there's other what if coaching hires, coaching decisions, coaching scenarios, and they can be multi-layered since I went off in tangents about a few of them. Tell me about them in the comments below. Also, make sure you check out my other videos, and please check out my Patreon, patreon.com/wrongsports. Link also in the description below, and have a fantastic rest of your day.